When it comes to our relationship with our significant others, oftentimes the assumption is that this person should be the recipient of our highest levels of attention, focus, understanding, compassion, and love. And yet the reality is this is frequently not the case. Oftentimes the person who we have promised to spend our lives with is actually the recipient of a lot of resentment, a lot of criticism, and a lot of impatience. And it's so important that we create an awareness of these feelings towards our partner so that we can get an understanding of why we feel this way and address it, as opposed to allowing it to snowball into a place of contempt. One of the most common causes of resentment that I come across is a person not feeling seen, recognized, heard, or valued within the context of the relationship. And this can occur in so many ways. It can be feeling that your needs are unimportant or not being met by your partner. It's a feeling of having more than your fair share of the household workload, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like as if the work that you are doing isn't being recognized, feeling like your emotional needs aren't being met, or indeed your physical needs aren't being met. And it all boils down to this sense of not being valued, of not being of worth in the relationship. So it's so important that you actually identify what is going on, because oftentimes we argue about very countertop superficial content, like who did the last wash, or things like that, which really don't address the underlying issue, which is I don't feel seen, I don't feel recognized, I don't feel loved. One of the most common causes of resentment that I see in relationships boils down to not feeling seen, not feeling heard, not feeling valued within the context of the relationships. And this can manifest itself in so many ways. Feeling like you take on more than your fair share of the household workload and the emotional burden of parenting or running a household. Feeling like your emotional or physical needs aren't being met. Feeling like your partner isn't interested in who it is that you actually are. And again, these little things tend to just accumulate into frustration that oftentimes pours out at a very inappropriate time. So we might just lose our shit over something that is no ways related to how it is that we're actually feeling within the context of the relationship. So it's about recognizing the small little things that irk you, the small little things that annoy you, and asking yourself, what is this actually telling me about how I feel about my role in the relationship and the actual state of the relationship? And the most common cause of resentment that I see in relationships all boils down to a feeling of not being seen, not being recognized, and not being valued within the context of the relationship. And this can manifest in so many different ways. I mean, if a person feels overwhelmed or overburdened with their role within the context of the household or the relationship, which frequently happens when kids come along, or indeed if a person feels like their emotional needs or mental needs or spiritual or physical needs aren't being met by the relationship. Oftentimes we can get really resentful towards the other person, and consequently everything that they do gets on our nerves. However, this is very unfair, because again, we need to be able to identify exactly what it is that's going on. And what we have a tendency to do is argue about very superficial stuff like who did the last load of washing, and ultimately that doesn't actually solve anything in the long run. So the first step is creating an awareness of how it is that the relationship is actually making you feel and what it is that needs to change in order for you to feel differently. So if you are experiencing a dissatisfaction in your relationship, you need to first of all be very clear about what it is and where it comes from, because oftentimes something is annoying us, but we layer on a lot of our emotional past experiences onto our actual reality. So for example, if we didn't feel recognized or validated as a child and we feel invalidated by our partner, all of a sudden it becomes so exaggerated, it becomes so overwhelmingly painful for us, and things can blow out of proportion. So it's about recognizing the impact of what is actually going on is having on you, what it is bringing up for you, and trying to keep things in context and in the perspective of the actual relationship. It's also trying to see things from the other person's perspective. Again, we tend to see things from our own point of view. We tend to see all of the things that we want to see, and often we don't recognize all of the stuff that our partner does do right. We just focus on what they don't do. So we need to be able to take a step back and be very objective about our expectations for them, but also be very compassionate as to what might be going on for them. Rather than jumping the gun and just assuming that they're being a bad partner, we have to recognize where their emotions are at, where their needs are at, our ability to hear them, to recognize them, and to value them. Because again, we can only expect them to treat us the way that we are actually willing to treat them. And oftentimes our assumption is that our partner should give, and that we shouldn't really have to do much of the work. So try and see things from as many perspectives as possible. Also be very aware of the rigidity of your thinking. We are very quick to jump to narratives of always and never, and they're very fixed. They assume that our partner never does anything right, or they always do X, Y, or Z. And again, we have to be very careful about our assumptions about people, and we have to be very realistic about our own mood and our own beliefs. Because I, for example, when I have PMS, nothing is right, and there's no pleasing me. And I think a lot of women struggle with this also. And it's recognizing that making kind of assumptions about your relationship when you're not necessarily in a good mood, or when you've had a particularly stressful day, isn't all that beneficial. So be very mindful of when you have these conversations. Make sure you come from a very kind, compassionate place, as opposed to going in all guns blaring. And try to be very understanding. Try to listen to the other person's point of view. Try to see their perspective, as opposed to just hammering out your own. Because again, it needs to be a compromise. It needs to be something that is reciprocal, and it needs to meet the needs of both people, as opposed to always being about one person. Be very mindful of your conditioning around relationships, which usually comes from our family of origin and may not be all that healthy. We need to be very aware of creating a relationship that works for us, as opposed to creating a relationship based on rigid concepts that we have about what relationships should entail. It's so important as well that we have an understanding of how we feel about ourselves, because when we have a low sense of self-worth, oftentimes we project that out into our interaction with our partner, and that's not very fair. So again, we have to be very accountable for how we feel about ourselves, and not let that get in the way of the needs that we discuss with our partner, because it is not their job to make us feel good about ourselves. We also have to enter any conversations with a willingness to compromise, and also a willingness to be proven wrong. We need to work towards the ultimate objective, which is the health of the relationship, as opposed to clinging on to our conditioning, clinging on to our ego, always wanting to prove ourselves right and make the other person feel inferior. Because ultimately, if one person feels bad, then the relationship isn't working. And sometimes this requires making a choice about the actual future of the relationship. Because ultimately, if you are continuously feeling resentment, if you are continuously feeling angry, and that you are not being heard and that your needs being met, then you need to take ownership of that, and you need to ask yourself if this is perhaps the right relationship for you. And I suppose that's a whole other decision that requires a lot of awareness, a lot of self-compassion, and a lot of ability to step into a place of uncertainty. If you would like to work on your relationship skills with yourself and with your partner, get in touch with me on the website. It's fundamentals.ie.